For most of history, Rome was the symbol of power. Its armies ruled continents, its laws shaped civilization, its roads connected a world that had never been connected before. And for almost 500 years, the Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean with one weapon more powerful than legions, more powerful than generals, more powerful than emperors: its currency. The Roman denarius, a small silver coin, became the backbone of global trade. Merchants trusted it. Soldiers were paid with it. Tribute from conquered lands was collected in it. As long as the denarius remained strong, Rome remained strong. But nothing destroys an empire faster than inflation, and Rome was the first great power in history to learn this lesson the hard way. To understand how Rome collapsed, you must understand how its money collapsed. In the beginning, the denarius was pure, 95% silver. It held its value because the metal inside the coin was worth something. But as the empire grew, so did its costs. Rome had the largest professional army the world had ever seen, 300,000 soldiers, later more than 500,000. It had roads, aqueducts, fortresses, borders stretching thousands of miles. And when emperors wanted to expand the empire, wars cost fortunes. At first, Rome paid for all of this through taxes and plunder, but eventually, plunder stopped. The empire reached its natural limits, and once Roman expansion ended, the money flowing in slowed, but government spending didn't. So emperors turned to the oldest financial trick in the world. They started cheating the currency. Instead of raising taxes, a move that would anger the elite, they simply reduced the silver content of the denarius. They melted old coins, added cheaper metals like copper, and minted new coins with the same face value but less real value. Citizens wouldn't notice at first. Merchants couldn't easily check purity, and the government could create money without limits. The first major debasement came under Emperor Nero around 64 AD. He reduced the silver content from 95% to 90%, small, subtle, but dangerous. Later emperors continued the process, 85%, 75%, 60%. By the 200s, Rome was fighting constant wars on its borders: Goths, Persians, Germanic tribes. Armies needed to be paid, so emperors debased the currency again, then again, and again, and again. By 260 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was no longer a silver coin. It was a bronze coin dipped in a thin silver coating. People could see the difference. Coins darkened after a few months. Merchants stopped accepting them at face value. Prices began to rise. Soldiers demanded more pay. Farmers raised food prices. Traders abandoned currency and demanded payment in grain, animals, or gold jewelry. Rome had entered full economic collapse. This wasn't caused by barbarians, not by invasions, not by politics. It was caused by inflation, a silent force that destroys empires from within. Because when money collapses, trust collapses. When trust collapses, society collapses. By the late 200s, the Roman economy was chaos. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 denarius now cost tens of thousands. Soldiers were being paid with worthless coins, causing mutinies. Inflation reached levels that modern economists would classify as hyperinflation. And with hyperinflation came something far worse: the breakdown of the social contract. Farmers stopped bringing food to cities. Cities depopulated. Trade froze. Tax collection collapsed. Government payrolls exploded. Corruption soared. Rome had created money out of nothing and paid the price. Panicked emperors tried to solve the crisis through authoritarianism. The most famous attempt came from Emperor Diocletian in 311 AD. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a law that set fixed prices for thousands of goods: grain, meat, clothing, transportation, wages. The punishment for violating the law was death. It was one of the first examples of state-controlled price fixing in history, and it failed immediately. Merchants stopped selling goods. Farmers abandoned markets. The black market exploded. Enforcing the edict was impossible. Instead of restoring order, it created more chaos. Diocletian tried to fix inflation through force, but inflation is stronger than force. It cannot be outlawed. It cannot be threatened into submission. It can only be prevented. But Rome didn't prevent it. Rome embraced it. And once the currency collapsed, the empire followed. By the 4th century, Rome was no longer an economic superpower. It was a bloated bureaucracy, constantly raising taxes that citizens could no longer pay. The government demanded taxes in gold because its own currency was worthless, so gold concentrated in the hands of the elite while ordinary citizens starved. The middle class collapsed. Entire regions depopulated. Small landowners abandoned their farms and handed their land to wealthy nobles in exchange for protection. This was the birth of feudalism, a system created by economic collapse. Without stable money, Rome could no longer maintain its armies. Soldiers deserted. Fortifications crumbled. Roads deteriorated. When Germanic tribes invaded, Rome could not resist because the empire was already dead from the inside. Inflation destroyed the currency. The destroyed currency destroyed the economy. The destroyed economy destroyed the empire. Not with fire, not with war, but with something far more silent and far more deadly, the loss of trust in money. And here is the most important lesson for the modern world. Rome did not fall because it ran out of silver. Rome fell because it created money without discipline, believing the consequences would never arrive. But they always arrive. Every empire that prints too much collapses. Rome was simply the first. By the time Rome entered the 4th century, the empire was no longer held together by prosperity, loyalty, or shared identity. It was held together by force, and even that force was collapsing. What inflation had begun, political chaos accelerated, but it all traced back to the same root. Once a currency loses trust, every system depending on it begins to crack. To understand this final stage, imagine being an ordinary Roman citizen in 320 AD. Your taxes have doubled and tripled within a decade. Your salary buys half of what it did last year. Coins in your hand feel lighter, thinner, cheaper. Local markets are empty because farmers refuse to accept money, and government officials, desperate for revenue, demand tax payments in gold, even though ordinary people rarely see gold in their entire lives. This wasn't just economic decline. It was the destruction of the Roman way of life. Rome had survived plagues. It had survived civil wars. It had survived invasions, but it could not survive the collapse of trust in its own currency. Inflation didn't just steal wealth. It rewired society itself. The rise of a new elite, the gold hoarders. As the denarius collapsed, one group thrived, those who controlled real assets, landowners, senators, military generals, high-ranking bureaucrats. They demanded rent, taxes, and payments in gold or grain, not in devalued coins. Gold became the true currency of Rome. The government's own money was treated like trash, useful only for small local purchases or paying off corrupt officials who accepted bribes. The wealthy hoarded gold because they saw what was coming. They saw the empire's money dying. And once they stopped using the denarius, the empire had no currency at all. The middle class, shopkeepers, craftsmen, traders disappeared. They couldn't raise prices fast enough to survive inflation. Many abandoned their businesses entirely and became dependent on wealthy landowners. This was not an accident. This was the predictable result of currency collapse. When money dies, wealth concentrates. When wealth concentrates, freedom dies. Rome proved this with mathematical precision. The collapse of Roman cities. For centuries, Rome's cities had been centers of trade and culture. But inflation turned them into economic graveyards. Merchants couldn't profit. Farmers refused to sell food. Soldiers demanded higher pay. Officials raised taxes endlessly. It was a death spiral. Urban populations fled to the countryside. Cities emptied. Large regions of the empire, North Africa, the Balkans, Gaul, saw their populations shrink by half. Rome had been a civilization built on cities, but inflation turned it into a landscape of abandoned markets and crumbling streets. The government tried desperate measures, forcing people to stay in their jobs, forcing farmers to sell grain at fixed prices, freezing wages, imprisoning or executing merchants who raised prices. Conscripting workers into state service. These were not economic policies. They were survival tactics of a dying empire, and none of them worked. The military crisis. When soldiers stopped trusting their pay. Perhaps the most dangerous effect of inflation hit the Roman army. Rome's military machine needed enormous funding: weapons, armor, food, horses, roads, fortresses, and, most importantly, pay for soldiers. A professional soldier risked his life daily. If his coin lost value, he lost everything. By the late 200s, soldiers were demanding raises constantly. Emperors who refused often faced mutiny. Emperors who agreed didn't have enough silver to pay, so they printed more debased coins. The result? Prices rose even faster. Soldiers demanded even more. Rinse and repeat. This spiraled into military anarchy. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 20 emperors, many of them assassinated by their own troops. Inflation had turned the Roman army, once the stabilizing force of the empire, into its greatest source of chaos. And when the army collapses, the borders collapse. Germanic tribes pushed deeper into Roman territory because the frontier defenses were crumbling. The Romans could no longer maintain their fortifications, supply lines, or troop numbers. Inflation had made the empire militarily weak, not because the enemies were stronger, but because Rome had destroyed the economic engine powering its army. Constantine and the Gold Reset. By the early 300s, the situation was so dire that Emperor Constantine attempted a radical fix, a new currency system based on gold. He introduced the solidus, one of the most stable gold coins in history. It contained nearly pure gold and remained almost unchanged for centuries. This stabilized parts of the empire temporarily, but the solidus had a dark side. Only the wealthy had gold. Only the elite had access to the solidus. Ordinary citizens were still trapped with worthless copper coins. So Constantine's reform helped the upper class and the military, but it crushed the poor even further. The empire now had two economies, one, a gold economy for the elite, two, a worthless paper-like economy for everyone else. The gap between rich and poor became impossible to bridge. Millions of Romans lived as serfs, tied to landowners in arrangements that resembled slavery. The modern world calls it feudalism. Rome called it survival. Inflation didn't just hurt Rome, it transformed it into something unrecognizable. The final spiral, when trust dies completely. By the time the Western Empire approached its final century, the effects of inflation had transcended economics. They infected every part of society. People no longer trusted the government. People no longer trusted the courts. People no longer trusted merchants or markets. People no longer trusted the currency. People no longer trusted the future. And when trust dies, nations die. Even wealthy Romans stopped believing in the empire. They hired private guards, built private fortresses, formed private alliances. They no longer looked to Rome for protection. They looked to themselves. The state had become irrelevant because its money was irrelevant. When Germanic tribes eventually marched into Roman lands, many Romans didn't resist. They negotiated. They simply switched allegiances. Why remain loyal to an empire that couldn't pay its soldiers, protect its borders, or keep its money from collapsing? Inflation had already done the real damage. The barbarian invasions were just the final push. And in 476 AD, the last Roman emperor fell. Not because Rome was conquered, but because Rome was empty. Economically, politically, spiritually. An empire cannot survive without stable money. Rome tried, Rome failed, and every empire since then has repeated the same mistake. The lesson for today: Rome's inflation was not unique. It was a preview. Every major world power that debased its currency followed the same path: rising debt, declining productivity, endless wars, political chaos, currency collapse, social fragmentation, elite wealth concentration, military weakness, final breakdown. Rome was the first, but it won't be the last. Inflation is not just an economic force, it is a civilizational force. It determines who wins, who falls, and who disappears. Rome created the greatest empire the world had ever seen, but inflation destroyed it from within, slowly at first, then suddenly. Just like every empire in history,